The room crackles with the kind of silence that hums louder than noise. Every seat filled, every flashbulb blinking like lightning behind storm clouds of tension. Alan Dershowitz leans back in his chair, voice smooth as marble, lecturing about constitutional morality as though he invented the phrase. His hands move like a conductor's, orchestrating self-assurance. Reporters scribble. A few nod, afraid not to. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett sits motionless, pen between her fingers. One tap, then another. Her eyes don't flinch, her posture unshaken by the avalanche of legal jargon pouring across the table. She waits, not for her turn, but for his mask to slip. Dershowitz smirks, ending his monologue with a flourish. And that, representative, is how reason must triumph over rhetoric. Crockett lifts her head slowly. "Professor," she says, her voice almost kind. "Just one question." The words float through the air like a fuse catching flame. He hesitates. An infinitesimal pause, barely a blink, but enough for every camera to see it. Then comes the silence. Heavy, electric, a silence that swallows the room whole. But to understand why that single question left him speechless, you have to know how this confrontation was born. Before the silence that stunned the room, there was noise, months of it. News panels arguing over ethics and ego, podcasts dissecting law like sport, headlines screaming about the fall of once untouchable men. And in the center of that chaos stood Alan Dershowitz, the scholar who had shaped generations of lawyers, now defending those accused of bending the nation's conscience. To some, he was still the genius of constitutional reason. To others, he'd become its last apologist. Each appearance carried the same undertone. He used to teach the law. Now he performs it. His brilliance hadn't faded. It had curdled into defiance, the kind that mistakes notoriety for relevance. Yet every time he spoke, cable networks leaned in. Because if arrogance sold headlines, he was a subscription. Then came Jasmine Crockett. New voice, new energy, unapologetically sharp. Her rise wasn't built on elite applause, but on community rooms, public defender grit, and the quiet confidence of someone who knows the ground she walks on. Where Dershowitz embodied the old guard's need to be heard, Crockett represented the new generation's refusal to be dismissed. When the committee announced the hearing, the media framed it as spectacle. Intellect versus firebrand, scholar versus challenger. But beneath the surface, it was something deeper, an argument over who defines morality in modern America. The professor who spoke for power, or the congresswoman who spoke from experience. As the day approached, social feeds lit up. Progressive circles buzzed with anticipation. Could authenticity finally puncture the armor of authority? Could truth, steady and unshaken, outshine the blinding glare of ego? Inside the hearing chamber that morning, the air was already split between eras. Reporters whispered that it felt less like politics and more like theater, a stage set for a reckoning. Cameras rolled. The old guard straightened their ties. The new guard adjusted their resolve. Dershowitz took his seat, certain of his control over the narrative. Crockett sat opposite him, pen resting quietly on paper. Neither needed introduction. Their reputations had already clashed in headlines. The entire country tuned in, none knowing they were about to witness a takedown that would rewrite the tone of political debate itself. Long before the cameras and controversy, Alan Dershowitz was the man young lawyers quoted as soundwise. The courtroom was his cathedral, the Constitution his scripture. He spoke with the conviction of a prophet, every sentence clipped, precise, alive with moral certainty. Truth, he once declared in a lecture that packed an auditorium to its walls, doesn't tremble under scrutiny. Students scribbled it down like gospel. Back then, he was the voice of intellectual rebellion, the defender of civil liberties, the scholar who dared to challenge the machinery of power. He could disarm a hostile prosecutor with a sentence, turn legal nuance into theater. In an age of gray morality, Dershowitz offered clarity, or at least the illusion of it. But time has a way of testing even the sharpest minds. Fame, once a byproduct, became a need. Applause replaced conviction as fuel. And the man who had once stood for principles began standing beside anyone who could keep his name in the headlines. Defending presidents, billionaires, and men accused of crimes that sicken the public, he called it loyalty to the Constitution. Critics called it a performance of rationalization. Archival clips play in contrast. Young Dershowitz declaring, "Justice must not only be done, it must be seen to be done." Cut to present-day sound bites. "Everyone deserves a defense," he insists, even the unpopular. The same words, but the music has changed. Where once his voice carried empathy, now it drips with practiced detachment. In one interview, he laughs off criticism. "I don't take sides, I take the law." But his smirk betrays something hollow. The law, as he uses it now, isn't a compass, it's a shield. Each appearance feels like an argument not for justice, but for himself. The fall wasn't sudden, it was incremental. Each defense of the indefensible dulled the edge of principle, replaced with justification. The professor of reason had become the performer of excuses. And yet, for all the accusations of hypocrisy, he never flinched. He leaned further in, convinced brilliance was immunity. Still, there were cracks, moments when the mask slipped. When confronted about his alliances, his eyes would narrow, and his words would rush faster, louder, as if speed could replace sincerity. Once, during a televised debate, a young journalist asked if he ever felt moral conflict in defending men accused of cruelty. He smiled and replied, "Morality doesn't pay the bills." The crowd laughed uneasily, unsure if he was joking. Behind the arrogance was a man terrified of irrelevance. Each headline, each invitation to defend another controversial client, kept his legacy alive a little longer. But legacy built on provocation isn't immortality. It's erosion disguised as relevance. He had become the very figure he once warned his students against. A man so enamored with intellect that he forgot wisdom. A man who preached truth's courage but flinched when it turned on him. By the time the congressional hearing arrived, Dershowitz wasn't coming to debate. He was coming to remind the room who he used to be. His tone, his smirk, his need to dominate the floor. It all came from a place of memory. He believed his reputation would still command silence. But arrogance has a habit of inviting its own undoing. And as he prepared to perform one more lecture on law and morality, he didn't realize the stage had changed. The audience was younger, sharper, less forgiving. They weren't dazzled by reputation. They wanted truth, not theater. And sitting across from him was someone who had built her life not on rhetoric, but on resilience. Jasmine Crockett's story doesn't begin in marble hallways or law school lecture rooms. It begins in Dallas, under the hum of streetlights and the weight of expectation. The daughter of working-class parents who believed in education like it was salvation, she learned early that dignity wasn't given, it was defended. She wasn't born into privilege or legacy. She built herself out of persistence, each obstacle a brick in her foundation. First-generation college student. First to take the LSAT. First to look around a courtroom and realize that the people most affected by injustice rarely had anyone who looked or spoke like her. When she became a public defender, she didn't just represent clients, she carried their stories. The woman accused of theft because she couldn't afford a lawyer. The teenager criminalized for poverty. The father deported for a paperwork error. Each face became another reason her voice could never waver. Her calm wasn't a facade. It was armor forged in rooms where shouting never won. When prosecutors barked, she learned the power of silence. That quiet, steady truth unsettles arrogance faster than rage ever could. Where others used volume to assert control, she used precision. Every sentence she spoke landed with intent. Every pause made the room listen. As her reputation grew, so did the discomfort of those unaccustomed to being challenged by a woman who refused to perform anger. They mistook composure for weakness until they faced her across a microphone. There was one hearing, years before the Dershowitz confrontation, where an older congressman interrupted her mid-sentence. She didn't flinch. "I'll yield my time," she said, voice even. Then, before he could smirk, she added, but not my right to be heard. The room fell silent. Even he had to lean back, realizing he'd walked into his own lesson. That was Jasmine Crockett's power. She didn't humiliate, she humbled. She didn't debate to dominate. She questioned to reveal. The same precision she used in court carried into Congress. Every inquiry a scalpel, every rebuttal a mirror. And each time arrogance cracked, it wasn't from force, but reflection. For her, politics wasn't theater, it was testimony. When she spoke, she brought the cadence of lived struggle, the rhythm of truth untaught in law schools. Her words carried both the patience of the courtroom and the urgency of the street corner. She made complexity feel human and power suddenly accountable. Colleagues described her as a storm that doesn't shout, it settles. To supporters, she was proof that the new generation of leaders didn't need to mimic the old. They only needed to be unafraid of their own authenticity. And yet, for all her grace, she carried steel underneath. The kind that doesn't seek applause, only justice. She didn't measure success by how many headlines she made, but by how many masks she removed. While others spoke to impress, one journalist wrote, after watching her dismantle a witness, she spoke to expose. And that difference made her unstoppable. So when Alan Dershowitz began his lecture that day, Jasmine Crockett was not just listening. She was loading the question that would end it. The air in the hearing room was electric, charged with the kind of anticipation that only follows arrogance on display. Alan Dershowitz leaned forward, hands clasped like a conductor guiding an orchestra of self-assurance. His voice boomed through the chamber, rolling over phrases like constitutional morality and legal precedent, as though the force of his vocabulary alone could wash away the unease hanging in the room. He spoke not just to defend a principle, but to justify a pattern. Every word seemed carefully chosen to dress moral compromise in academic silk. He called it neutrality. Others saw evasion. Yet, he smiled as if convinced that brilliance could still outshine decay. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett sat still. No gestures, no interruptions. Just her eyes, steady, unblinking, tracing each word as if weighing its worth before allowing it entry into memory. Her pen tapped once, then stopped. The microphones caught the faint hum of the room, the rustle of papers, the nervous shifting of aides who suddenly seemed unsure whether they were witnessing a lecture or a performance. Dershowitz gestured toward her mid-sentence, a patronizing flourish. Congresswoman Crockett, you of all people should understand that emotion has no place in constitutional interpretation. The statement drew polite laughter from one side of the room, forced brittle. Even his supporters didn't quite meet his gaze. Crockett didn't flinch. Her stillness became louder than his voice. The silence she held wasn't empty. It was pressure, a mirror, waiting for him to see what he had become. Then, as his monologue began its next self-congratulatory turn, she leaned slightly forward. Her tone, calm and almost gentle, sliced through the tension like glass through cloth. "Professor," she said softly, "just one question." The words landed like a gavel. The cameras swung toward her, catching the precise moment his expression faltered, his smirk pausing mid-formation, his posture stiffening as though instinct recognized danger before reason could. Reporters leaned forward. Staffers froze mid-note. Even the chairman looked up. For a heartbeat, the room was utterly still. And with that one sentence, the narrator's voice would echo later. The tone of the entire hearing changed. "Professor," she repeated, her voice unshaken. "Just one question." Dershowitz smiled, a rehearsed expression that once disarmed audiences, now flickering under fluorescent lights. "Of course, Congresswoman," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Ask away." Crockett leaned in slightly, eyes steady, posture unbroken. Then came the line that would echo across the country. "If truth doesn't fear questions," she asked, her words landing slow and deliberate, "why do you always defend those who hide from them?" For a heartbeat, nothing moved. The sound in the chamber seemed to vanish. Even the clicking cameras paused, as if the air itself held its breath. Dershowitz blinked once, twice. His lips parted, but no sound came. He searched for the scaffolding of rhetoric that had always been there, the quicksilver wit that turned accusation into theory. But this question wasn't a trap of law. It was a mirror of conscience. And in it, he saw reflection, not argument. A whisper rippled through the room. A staffer dropped a pen. Somewhere in the back, a reporter mouthed, "Wow." The silence grew heavier, pressing down until even the hum of the microphone seemed to disappear. Crockett didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She simply waited. That patience was the final blow, the calm of someone who didn't need victory, declared to know it had arrived. Finally, he tried to recover. "Congresswoman, I defend the principles of due process." She interrupted, not with volume, but precision. "Due process doesn't mean moral absence, Professor. It means accountability under truth. And you've built a career confusing the two." His breath caught. The flash of defensiveness flickered in his eyes. The same look he once gave cross-examiners decades ago, now turned against him. She continued, her tone scalpel sharp. "You've said the law must rise above politics. Yet time after time, your clients are those who weaponize power against it. So tell me, when does principle stop being principle and start being performance?" Every sentence stripped another layer of his authority. His hands, once animated, now clasped tightly. His famous confidence wilted under the weight of composure. Reporters typed furiously. The gallery leaned in. The tension was no longer about disagreement. It was about exposure. Crockett pressed one final point, voice steady as a verdict. "You taught generations that truth doesn't tremble under scrutiny. But today, Professor, it's trembling, and it's standing right in front of you." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thunder wrapped in stillness. The camera zoomed in on his face, jaw tight, eyes darting, intellect searching for cover. There was none. The chair squeaked softly as she leaned back, folding her notes with unhurried grace. Around her, staffers exchanged glances of disbelief. One whispered, "Did that just happen?" It had. Within minutes, clips hit Twitter. Millions watched, replayed, and captioned the moment. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. That's how you end a debate, with dignity. Crockett just did what generations dreamed of. She made arrogance answer to truth. The video spread like electricity across screens, across time zones, across divides. Viewers didn't just see a political exchange. They saw a moral shift. In the chamber, Dershowitz finally managed a faint, forced smile, as if pretending the wound was mutual. But his silence betrayed him. For a man who always had the last word, he now had none that could stand. Crockett gathered her papers, her calm undisturbed, her presence radiating quiet authority. There was no triumph in her eyes, only the assurance of someone who had simply told the truth and watched it do its work. And when it was over, the narrator would say, as the camera lingered on the frozen faces, the silence in that chamber spoke louder than any verdict. By nightfall, the clip had already escaped the walls of Congress and entered the bloodstream of the internet. It began with one post, an edited 26-second video titled simply, "When Truth Finally Asked Back." Within an hour, it was everywhere. Hashtag Crockett versus Dershowitz. Hashtag Truth Wins. Hashtag Ask the Question. Hashtags multiplied like wildfire. On TikTok, teens turned the silence after her question into remix soundtracks. On Twitter, side-by-side edits compared Crockett's poised stillness with Dershowitz's faltering confusion. One caption read, "The end of the old debate order." Another, "New generation, new rules." Cable networks scrambled to catch up. Analysts replayed the moment frame by frame, calling it a study in intellectual restraint. Commentators described it as the day composure became a weapon. Even those who once dismissed Crockett as a newcomer admitted something undeniable. She hadn't just won an argument. She had shifted the entire atmosphere. Across college campuses, law professors assigned the clip in classes. "Watch how she pauses," one said. "That's control. That's credibility." Students nodded, whispering that it was the kind of moment they'd tell their kids about. The instant the tone of American discourse tilted toward truth again. Cable talk shows ran split screens. Dershowitz through the years, fiery and unflinching, beside a single still image of him frozen mid-hearing, lips parted but voiceless. The memes were merciless but pointed. One showed him labeled Professor of Silence. Another, viral overnight, read, "When the question is the verdict." But beyond the humor was admiration. Millions didn't just see a debate, they saw a mirror. A nation tired of noise, craving authenticity. The calm that had once been underestimated now felt revolutionary. Crockett's inbox overflowed with messages. Teachers, mothers, young public defenders writing that they felt seen. One email read, "You showed my daughter that intellect can be fierce without being loud." Another said, "Thank you for proving that truth doesn't need permission to be powerful." Meanwhile, Dershowitz issued a statement, attempting to reframe the exchange as a misinterpretation of intellectual nuance. But the words fell flat. The internet had already written its own verdict, and this time, it wasn't his courtroom. On late-night TV, a comedian summed it up best. Dershowitz spent decades arguing that every question deserves an answer. Turns out, there's one he couldn't handle. Laughter rolled through the audience, not cruel, but cathartic. What had begun as a single hearing now felt like a cultural tremor. 1,000 think pieces bloomed overnight. Titles like "The Power of Stillness in a Shouting Age" and "How Crockett Redefined the Modern Debate." And as the sun rose the next morning, it was clear this wasn't just viral content. It was a moment of moral clarity breaking through the noise. But beyond the trending clips, something deeper was happening, a moral reset. As the headlines faded and the hashtags cooled, what lingered wasn't the spectacle, it was the stillness. The image of Jasmine Crockett, poised behind that microphone, had transcended politics. Her calm had become a language of its own, one that millions instinctively understood. Truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. In a culture addicted to outrage, her restraint felt radical. Every pause, every measured breath stood in defiance of a world that mistakes volume for conviction. She hadn't come to perform, she'd come to remind. And in doing so, she reframed what power could look like: quiet, grounded, and unshakably precise. Commentators tried to define what happened that day, but Crockett herself said it best when asked about the viral clip. "If we can't face questions," she replied, "we don't deserve power." It wasn't a jab, it was a mirror, a challenge to anyone who speaks without listening, leads without accountability, or hides behind intellect when the truth calls their name. What made her words extraordinary wasn't their sharpness, it was their steadiness. She didn't destroy Dershowitz. She disarmed the culture of arrogance he represented. Her victory wasn't over a man, it was over a mindset. A reminder that brilliance without integrity corrodes, and that real strength is often measured in composure, not control. Across dinner tables, classrooms, and offices, people began quoting her question, not as a political soundbite, but as a personal check-in. If truth doesn't fear questions, what am I avoiding? In that reflection lay her true impact. She turned confrontation into introspection, performance into purpose. America, for a fleeting moment, saw what political courage could look like without spectacle. She made calm contagious. She made dignity desirable again. And perhaps most importantly, she reminded the country that accountability isn't cruelty, it's care for the public trust. As one editorial put it, she didn't destroy him. She reminded America what strength really sounds like. That line became a refrain, echoing through social media, stitched into speeches, whispered in spaces where truth still fought to be heard. Crockett's question became more than a viral moment. It became a modern parable about who we choose to be when faced with power, and how the most transformative voices are often the ones that never lose their calm. Because in that congressional chamber, under the glare of cameras and history, Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak truth to power. She made power answer to truth. And for millions watching, That one question became more than a moment. It became a movement. He came armed with arguments. She came armed with truth. And when the moment arrived, one question ended decades of noise. Jasmine Crockett didn't shout, didn't gloat. She simply asked what arrogance couldn't answer. In that silence, history shifted. If you believe truth doesn't tremble under arrogance, share this moment. Subscribe and stand with the movement proving that composure isn't weakness. It's power. Because when the world forgets what integrity sounds like, voices like hers remind us. Dignity still wins. And sometimes, all it takes is one question to make the mighty fall silent.